time constraint is not easy. In terms of limiting my, okay, I have three, I don't know how I can go, I have three, I have some slides and three topics to talk about. One is to think of taxation as a basis for financing social, structural transformation. Africa needs a paradigm shift in its thinking about development and in formulating development strategies. The second one is the main principles upon which a taxation system that can finance social structural transformation should be based. And the third part is a case study of 8 countries which tax the system of Africa and Christian aid. I will just refer to the main findings and recommendations which are at the end of the report. I think some copies are being distributed. Okay, first point. What do I mean by paradigm shift? Two things. Just examples. Those of you who have done development studies or development economics would know about the so-called vicious circle of poverty. The basic thing was saving, investment depends on saving. Only those who have money can save. Poor people cannot save, so they cannot invest. So what South Africa advised to do was to rely on external resources when the capital is abundant. These were official development assistance, foreign direct investment, and taking credit from bilateral and institutions and private ones. I cannot go into detail. Dependence on these three external resources for development has not worked. I don't think anybody will need a proof for that. The last 40 years, heavy dependence on these external resources, Africa has not worked well. The second one is the most important one is again within the paradigm which we face in Africa, the existing of what Joseph Stiglitz calls trickle-down effect or trickle-down economics. The expectation is it is almost given as a universal law. Development starts with widening inequality, and at some point there will be a curve where growth can be then shared in a more equitable manner. So the trickle-down effect has also not worked. We have seen, as I will come back to the study done by Christian Aid, growth has not, in fact, growth has in some cases aggravated inequality instead of reducing it. Okay. The second one I said is about the principles on which the principle on which a taxation policy should be based if we want to make taxation the Of course, the purpose of tax is to ensure revenue for public expenditure. The second one is its redistribution function. The third one is the repricing that it would make, for example, to reduce externalization of costs, support local industries from unequal competition coming from outside. All these are tools that the tax policy could use to advance structural transformation. The last and not but the least one is the representation function. A government which depends more on resources generated in its own country will be inevitably more responsive and accountable to the citizens who are contributing in the form of taxes. So revenue, mobilization, redistribution, repricing, and representation should be the pillars upon which a local, a national taxation policy should be based. The other one is taxation. What's happening now in Africa is actually it started as a subversive statement to civil society, but now it is recognized by every institution, multilateral, bilateral, that Africa, for example, loses more resources
than it gets through tax dodging than it gets through development aid. The figures vary. OECD says for every dollar coming into Africa, $3 leave the continent. And it's very simple arithmetic. +1 and -3, -2. So under such a situation, there is no possibility of covering costs which social structural transformation requires. There are time is short. I cannot go into the mechanisms used for tax dodging. Just to give you, you might have heard about the existence of tax havens and what they do. I'll just throw at you some figures. The mechanism of tax dodging by using secrecy jurisdictions has a result that the Isle of Jersey, which is between the UK and France, is the major exporter of banana to Europe. Okay, I cannot answer why this happens now. I'm in a hurry, but keep this figure. The British Virgin Islands has 34 times companies registered more than inhabitants. All these mechanisms are there to facilitate resource outflow and tax dodging from our continent. So, combating tax dodging, changing the -3, and being less dependent on the 1%, on the one coming from the external sources should be the agenda for domestic resource mobilization. It is always in the campaign of civil society, the attention was increased development aid. But that is not really what will help us to finance our structural transformation. Keep the resources generated in Africa to fund our social structural transformation. Finally, taxation should ensure vertical and horizontal equity. That means if you look at what is happening in Africa, I'll come also in the case study, the burden of taxation is relatively being put more and more on the poor than on the rich and multinational companies, which are getting richer. This has to change. Of course, something we have to also accept is that the revenue authorities should have more transparency and effectiveness in collecting taxes. That is something that should be that should be considered as a serious problem. And the other one is taxation by itself cannot get the legitimacy a government requires unless it is also used in a progressive manner to improve the living conditions of the poor and to generate economic growth that can be equitable and sustainable. So the way spending is structured and done, and that transparency in how spending is done and how the decisions are taken and how it is executed is also an important aspect of tax justice. So briefly now on the case study. This case study refutes what is called the trickle-down effect. Most African countries have been growing at a world record rate, but in most of the countries which were taken as case study, inequality was in fact growing, not going down. The second finding is, even in countries where it is not growing, it is not decreasing. The second finding is, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer in relative terms, and in some countries also in absolute terms. The third one is illicit financial flows from Africa are high and growing. Actually, in the last report from GFI, Africa is the continent where illicit finance, the percentage in the share of illicit financial flows globally, the percentage coming from Africa is growing more than in other regions of the world. The third one is there is a limited direct taxation on higher income and wealth, especially the high net worth individuals in many rich countries enjoy exemptions, and their contribution to the public revenue is minimal. Big losses are being emanating from generous tax incentives for companies. And this issue of tax incentives, actually, if you go into the details, it is how this, if you go to that it's my favorite example. I don't know how many of you know Dar es Salaam. I have been working in the region for 12 years. There is a hotel which changed its name every 4 or 5 years. When I went there, it was called Palm Beach, and later it became Sheraton, and now I think it is called Movenpick, and a Christian partner called it Movenpick or Pick and Move. So the thing is, tax holiday is given to them. The moment they become eligible to pay taxes, they will dispense with it and go elsewhere. I can give you many examples of how tax incentives are, in the first place, not achieving what they are economically supposed to achieve. And the second thing is they have enhanced tax competition between African countries. When it started, it was 5 years. And I know of countries now which have gone to 20 years of tax holiday. And again, another Christian partner said when we were discussing this, but I thought you take holiday after you have worked. How can you take it from the very beginning? So at any rate, it is time for us to distinguish between scavengers and investors. Because any serious investor should be concerned about the future of the country in which it is investing. Only those who are out for hot profit and quick profit are there to be interested in tax holidays and tax incentives. The other one is there is structural constraints and lack of political will to reform tax systems in Africa and also to take effective measures to combat tax evasion. So the recommendations, I'm sorry, I'm running out. It is the emphasis on indirect taxes is harming Africa. The emphasis on indirect taxes will shift the tax burden on the poor, relatively speaking. So more direct taxes on corporate income tax and a progressive personal income tax, which also includes liberal professions. Then there should be a reconsideration of reducing, the incentives, the exemptions, and what together technically they are called tax expenditure. There should be an analysis of tax expenditure, and it should be also a public thing. The government should be accountable for the concessions and exemptions it is granting to multinational companies. Okay, there are other demands. There are some of the issues I raised cannot be combated at the national level. There is, for example, I told about the existence of so many companies in British Virgin Islands. It's an overseas territory under the British Crown. And it will not be possible for African countries to challenge the practice on that island. So it is the responsibility of the British government to see, for example, very, very easy things which are not revolutionary at all. It is about knowing the beneficial owners of a certain company so that they can be held accountable for what they are doing, so that mispricing does not take place. I cannot go into detail. In general, within the global context, for me, development cooperation, international development cooperation should have as its major component issue of tackling tax dodging globally and making impossible for tax secrecy jurisdictions to facilitate corruption money, tax dodging products, and see the suite. Okay. Am I in 10 minutes?
Yes, you are in 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
For Africa is one of our concern and the problematic region in the Africa. But what I realized that in many cases, our brother in West Africa, they are not very much familiar with the situation that we are there. I think from yesterday we have a very good overview about what constitutes functional and income inequality and in the process of this transformation. What I'm going to do is to move beyond the functional inequality towards to the composition, how composition of the government spending is matter on the process of this inequality, and also addressing issues related to the public policy, and in addition to that, how we will be able to shape what we call it the economic geography in the country within the context of poverty and inequality. So those are generally the three areas what I'm going to focus on. The first idea is that there are three questions I may not be able to answer, but I will try to see what we can do on this relation of the government spending in the context of the PRSP process and the previous framework SAPS. As you all aware that during 70s and 80s that we have all these SAPS programs, and then the big propaganda, either you take SAPS or you collapse at that time. So we have taken SAPS and we have also went wrong. So again, we'll try to see how we can address the inequality within the framework of this, what you call it, the policy, the policy framework, the macroeconomic policy framework. The first question is simple. Should there be any policy objective to be considered in addressing the structural inequality? And this is related very much to the what we call the decomposition of income, the sources of income that were causing this inequality. So how we are going to address that from the policy perspective? What are the optimal arrangement for addressing both structural and transitory? Sometimes inequality is a very transitory issue related to the policy, and sometimes it's a very institutionalized in the country when you're talking about some sectors. And I don't want to talk about the growth here, but in many cases, when you have a growth, always in any country, if you look to Ghana, if you look to Sudan, if you look to any country in South Africa, you will see the growth is always generated, especially in some sectors or in some areas, in towns, in that. So that's the idea of, and that's why sometimes I really, although I'm an economist, sometimes I'm very much confused when we talk about inclusive growth. And I don't believe that growth will be inclusive, and it shouldn't be desirable to be growth is an inclusive, but the challenge is how the benefit of growth to be very fair distributed among the rest of the area, because there's some concern about these things. The third question is what should shape the government policies in competing priorities? We are working under what we call it hard budget constraint, like the time now given to me. No space. We are working under very hard budget constraints where there is a very limited resource envelope where you should allocate all this. And what's make it more harder now is the advocacy groups, the NGOs groups. They are making too harder even for the policymaker to go more on this. So what we constitute the ideal economic analysis now, we are in a very terrible situation, because when we talk about the public spending in one side, immediately we talk about the new development assistance framework, which is poverty reduction strategy paper, and most of the PRSP countries are adopted, is that entail we have to increase our spending or our composition of spending in what we constitute the pro-poor spending. The pro-poor spending, which is that to align the government spending towards the social sector, where we believe that we can reach MDGs. But always that is not the case. We have allocated too much resources in the social sector, as you can see in the figures and the graphs, but that is not the case. The pro-poor approach is a very poor approach. I'm sorry to say that. We allocate the resources to the social sector. The outcome of that sector is really a big concern. The question is, what is the unusual consensus toward that the dichotomy between the private sector, between the pro-poor sector or investing in the social sector, that will automatically translate to the growth and also addressing the issues related to the inequality. There is no theory about that.
You have less than 5 minutes.
You let my colleagues very relaxed way, and anyway, I will. So that is, anyway, that is the way that we are shaping it. I don't know. So we have the public policy, which is related to the composition of the government, which should come first. Shall we spend in the infrastructure sector? As a prerequisite to enabling the environment for the proper spending, and then we have a good environment for the policy change, and then we have improved all the outcomes, or we allocate all the resources toward the social sector and the government end up with a stagnated enrollment ratio. It's still the health service we provided, but it's not satisfactory basis in a manner. And then we ignore all the other issues related to the income, use, and employment, and all these things. So there is a false dichotomy between what the advocacy group they are looking for and what we are seeking to generate. I will illustrate this with some graph. This is a Sudan a household survey in 2009, ranking the poverty line according to the states. We have 15 states in the northern Sudan. What we have realized, those states has a very much relation, this is a Lawrence curve, but with three major issues. The 15 states, we rank them according to the other social indicators outcome. We combine both the secondary and primary data, and we realize that the state with the provision of infrastructure, they are better off even in the other social indicators, which include all the MDGs indicators. And that was very, very, very critical results for us. And also when we look to the poverty and how they are related, we look to the poverty not only, we say that poverty like clans in Sudan. We may be poor, but in relative terms. So we have three categories of poor. We have people who are living in absolute poverty, abject poverty, and then we have those groups that fail to switch to high return activities. They are not poor, neither rich. They are trying to strive their ways. And then we have others who are directly influenced by the macroeconomic policies. Those who are a problem with the productive assets and those who are engaged in the private sector, whether formal or informal sectors. We define them by these groups. What we realize that even when you look to the composition of the government spending, because we are using the federal system in Sudan, and I am very much afraid now our brothers in Kenya, they are 1 year old in this devolution. Devolution is an opportunity, but it's a big challenge. When you look to these graphs, you'll see the range of the government transfer to the provinces or the states. Too much resources going to the state, but again, what's happening? The enrollment ratios, according to all these figures, the enrollment ratio correlated also very positively with the poverty line and correlated positively with the state ranks according to the central government. And this is clearly illustrates that building a school doesn't necessarily mean that students will go or pupils will go to those schools. The number of schools that we doubled the number of schools from 1995 to 2005, 10 years, the number of schools, we built them doubled, but the enrollment is still beyond 60% of those total, which means that supply side alone cannot do anything. And that is require a new public thinking. And that's why we're asking ourselves, do we are really facing intellectual debate, intellectual deficit in addressing, yes, MDGs are desirable, but are we prioritizing for how to achieve those things? What I'm trying to conclude in the nutshell in this presentation is that composition of the public spending is important, is critical in analyzing the relation between lagging and leading area in the country. Even you look to the US, you will see that the Western coast is very advanced, California and those, but still the other cost is, if you compare it in relatively, the people in the Western Quarter are very advanced than the rest. But doesn't mean that. So we shouldn't also look to the inequality as a way of punishing those who are doing well. But we should look at it in a different way. It's the fairness of distribution of the government resources so that we offer the opportunities rather than the way that we are, rather than looking to it as we bring the gaps of those who are doing well down so that to have a horizontal kind of Gini coefficient less. The Gini coefficient in Niger is 3.35. It is equivalent to the Gini coefficient in UK. It is the same. But I'm quite sure those who are below in the UK, they are less. They are enjoy the minimum level of social services in UK than those who are in upper middle income in Niger. And that also will show you it is better to look in this equality discourse in a fairness in the provision of services, in try to ensure that much better that we can allow others to enjoy on the living condition rather than to go that. And also, please, our colleagues who are working in the advocacy groups, NGOs, don't push the government too much so that they cannot even to lose the rationality of the policy analysis in the government. I am sure our colleagues at the Ministry of Finance, Treasury people, they are under very, very difficult consideration when to share that cake between what is right and all the things are right. Let me just finish with the joke. Since you are not allowing me to, but I will just get to there is a funny, Jiha is a funny character in Arabic, you call it. So people use him always to illustrate the ideas. There are two persons dispute the matter, and then they came to make arbitration between them. And they asked, the first person explained his case, and he was right. So Jiha told him that, yes, you are right. The second person also explained his case, and he said that you are also right. There is a gentleman who was sitting behind him. He asked him, Jiha, how come they ask you to do an arbitration and the both of them are right? He said that you are also right, because the two cannot be right at the same time. So we cannot be also right at the same time while you are advocating for the social sector and the infrastructure is not there. Thank you.
Okay, we thank you very much, the panelists. The idea was to stimulate, raise a number of things for discussion. I won't try to pick anything from anywhere. Please make some, you can contribute to the issues that are raised, either as questions or as comments. And you may also raise issues that have not been raised, which are significant, but please keep them as brief as possible to 2 minutes maximum. And when you can disagree with each other, the floor as well. Thank you. The gentleman behind.
No, thank you very much. I was attracted to this session because it's about the financing. But my areas, I came to social policy from development studies. Of financing, you know, countries differ. Okay, the resource base of Nigeria is not the resource base of Benin Republic, and therefore, the financing instruments available to Nigeria are not available to Benin Republic. So that's one dimension. Second thing is that ultimately in the structural transformation, in which, to just a very simple thing, for us to produce what we consume and to consume what we produce. This and all other things are damaging our balance of payment. We're still basically primary commodity, producers. Within the context of the Lagos Plan of Action, there is an infrastructure, what do you call it, agenda, very elaborate. There is a difference, however, between infrastructure meant to facilitate business and infrastructure for people. Africa has never lacked for infrastructure to move commodities out. Look at our railways that were built under colonialism. They were meant to move, what do you call it? You move your, what do you call it, groundnuts, your cocoa from the something to the coast. They were not meant for us. If we rode on those trains, we were incidental, or they were meant to move labor from the labor reserves into the something and this and that. To think of infrastructure in the context of a transformation of African agenda, we've got to combine infrastructure in terms of moving people to moving goods and moving services. That's one dimension. Second thing, in terms of tax, okay? And we have the various examples from Lagos State, for instance, in Nigeria, to the example that French in Sierra Leone was raising when Britain pulled out its something because it's a disagree, that the donors have made us lazy, okay, about actually thinking seriously. And believe me, it's the greatest curse that has happened to us. And I always tell some of my colleagues who are in the donor business, maybe it's important for you to just go away for some time. Okay, my auntie will say, na poor, not be say I crazy. I may be poor, but I ain't stupid. Okay? And we become lazy, okay, in many ways in actually things. Sierra Leone and Lagos, the remarkable growth in tax revenue because they had to focus on actually generating. Final point, there is no contradiction between social investment in education and economic outcome. Again, Lagos Plan of Action. If you don't invest in the education of your people, if you don't invest in the healthcare, where are you going to get the engineers? Where are you going to get the doctors? So it's true that the NGOs and the cash transfer is a classical example of that. That's why I raised the point earlier on today about the Brazil that is told. We are told only a partial story of Brazil. I am a beneficiary of public education. If it depended on the resources of my parents, I probably would be a cobbler somewhere in Ibadan. When we invest, we are not investing in other people, we're investing in our people. If number of schools were built and the enrollment did not rise, my brother, it's the problem of those who built the school. Did you consult people? Did you engage with people? If there's one thing that draws Africans, okay, from colonial period, if somebody dominated you, wanted to know why they dominate you. Education was one instrument, okay? So I think it's important that we avoid a situation where we start thinking that somehow investment in education takes resources away from, it's like it's investment, okay? The issue of taxation, I'm just summarizing now, that the instruments available to countries will vary from country to country. We cannot allow Nigeria to get away with thinking that income tax, there's a lot of oil revenue. All those people who have become multi-billionaires and are spending in a very gratuitous way at tapping to the oil revenue, okay? Gabon, if you look at social outcome, investment of the money is not happening. We need to spend these resources, but finally, is the regional development strategy that is embedded in Lagos Plan of Action. Our regional economic communities were set up precisely for those reasons. It's about coordination. And we need to go back to those issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Jimmy. I think this is very enlightening, but please, so that we can...
But I'm just looking through the executive summary. And I appreciate very much the reference to inequality and the fact that, of course, taxation is not just a source for revenues, it is primarily that, but also has a distributional impact. One thing that, one argument that some people make around the expansion of taxes that are regressive, so the reliance, for instance, on VAT or indirect taxes that tend to be regressive, is that, well, they're easier to implement with respect to other taxes, but also that even though they are regressive, the revenue generated can then be used to correct for this regressive distributional impact. The argument being, therefore, that in some sense the distributional impact of taxation isn't that important because we can correct it through spending. I was just wondering whether you could reflect on this and what your thoughts are with respect to actually whether the incidence of tax is important. Thank you.
A railway infrastructure developed from, let's take West Africa, from Nigeria, the south, to, let's say, Bolgatanga in Ghana, or to Burkina Faso. Each government should contribute something so that at the end of the day, we should be able to move. Look at women sitting on top of trucks and then, transporting food. If you have a good railway system, couldn't these women even sleep in the train whilst they are bringing their goods down? So let us look at some of these things and ensure proper, I'm repeating, gender-sensitive data gathering. Thank you.
When we look back at Africa, like in the last decade, you'll come up with about 2 countries in Africa that could be classified as middle-income countries. Today, we have 26 middle-income countries in Africa. And out of those ones, there are 10 of them that are classified as upper middle-income countries. By 2025, there will be about 41 middle-income countries in Africa. So what does that tell us? My question is, what are we going to do to mobilize resources to finance development in Africa, taking into consideration that ODA has been falling rapidly? And we have to look at a strategy, and that will be domestic resource mobilization strategy. We've talked a lot about commoditization in Africa. Most of us are still producing primary commodities. How do we add value to those things? But beyond that, I want to ask the panelists to tell us, in the context of many African countries now being classified as middle-income countries, how should we finance development that will take into consideration the fact that 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa, and at the same time, 7 of the 10 most unequal countries in the world are also in Africa? So that's my first question. The second point that I want to make, it's about a lot of people that I've listened to, particularly in the last 2 days. They have talked about the fact that we can use social protection mechanism as a way of bridging the gap between the rich and the poor, in the sense that, of course, many African economies have been growing rapidly, but that growth has not translated quickly into poverty reduction, and that growth has not taken everybody on board. And so those who have not been taken on board, we could use social protection strategy to help them. So my question is, we have seen that being done in some countries, particularly in South Africa, where I currently live, and you've seen that level of dependency on social protection system. And will that be a way forward in terms of using financing for development to actually also deal with equity? So I want to hear, particularly from Dereje, who I think I used to interact with when I was in Addis Ababa, to basically tell us how social protection can come into this equation of financing development. Thank you.
Observe that most of the discussions we've been having on these issues have always been, coming out with a wish list. So I'm really happy the direction that this conversation is taking us now towards how are we going to make it happen. Because definitely if we have a shopping list, we need finances for it to see the order of the day. But my main concern is when we talk about taxation, most of the time, the real issues around illicit financial flows, they remain there on the paper. And what we see on the ground is, increased taxation in terms of domestic resource mobilization, and before you know it, commodities like tea, sugar, and so on that everybody has to buy, especially the poor, would be taxed. And women have, they feel the pinch more than anybody else. So for me, I would like to see, more of the things we discuss around illicit financial flows and what our government and us can also do to address the issue rather than, increasing taxes all the time. And one thing we have also not exploited enough, I think, is the issue of accountability. Because supposing we even have all the money that we need in order to finance this, and then it is not well accounted for, or there are no mechanisms for accountability in place, I don't think we will still move any further. Then my last point would be, in most of our countries, I remember just the other day, we heard that Nigeria has been reclassified and has moved, one step up the economic ladder. But if we look at the life of the ordinary Nigerian, have their lives moved in accordance with the country? So these are some of the, I think we need to have honest discussions with ourselves. Thank you.
I want to link with what Roslyn has just said in terms of illicit flows. And I think illicit flows, capital flows, is not just an issue for Africans. I think it goes beyond the continent. It also touches on the countries where this money is going. And I'm wondering what mechanisms are there that we can use to ensure that even the countries that are receiving these funds are also accountable and at least can also do something about ensuring that these funds don't go out of the continent and can be used here. So it's a question of both the receiver and those who are who are sending the funds out. And I'm just wondering, we can reflect, how can we work better with those governments to ensure that this doesn't happen? My brother from Sudan mentioned something about devolution in Kenya, which I think it's really good to reflect on that as well. Because when we were working on this constitution in Kenya, for us it was really the best mechanism to curb inequalities between regions, between state and the regions. But now it's turning out to be a complete reverse of what we thought. There's more state control, and then it's also creating corrupt elites within the system, especially in the counties, because that's what we thought. Transfers of funds to the counties will actually curb the inequalities. Now, I'm just wondering, we can all reflect, what other systems are there that work better than this, that can assist? Because definitely after 1 year, this has not worked for Kenya. So it's really important to think about that. And lastly, my brother who talks about education as an investment, I really agree with that. And we can look at education and the economic gains that they bring. But today, there is pessimism. It's serious pessimism about the system and what it does to the youth, especially, that we are told this morning, they form 65% of our continent or most of our countries, and they are idle. They have all the education you can imagine. They are so idle, and so I'm just wondering, where are the economic gains then when these people are idle and they've gone through an education? We've invested in them, but we cannot support them in terms of making use of that education and also creating jobs for them.
Structural transformation, or should we be asking resources for equitable development? Question for us all. Secondly, to Nancy, the point about the balance between spend. Should we be spending on infrastructure or on social programs? The question is, can we afford not to spend? And the proposal for me is, really, we need to undertake a detailed cost analysis of what it will mean cost-wise if we do not spend on equalization of opportunities. And final question, if we focused our attention more on the financing side, which I propose we don't, but if we did, there is a whole range of issues that we need to think about. First of all, there is community resources, which are never talked about, and the role that community resources can play. At the moment, they're struggling quite a lot because they're under stress. So my question is, shouldn't we be looking at mechanisms for protecting community resources that go to, for example, social protection, which we know has been the hallmark of African society. And then there is a range of other instruments, domestic resources, foreign direct investments, remittances, private flows, and aid, et cetera, with respect to domestic resources, a lot has been said. I won't go further into that. On remittances, facilitation of transfers and working on issues of fees and costs might actually help make this better. Similarly, I agree with the point about limiting the flight of capital and working with especially northern countries to follow the money where it is illicitly taken out of Africa. And finally, on that point, promoting transparency and promoting information access as a definite and objective towards ensuring that these issues are not simply in the realm of the elite, but much more discussed by the whole fraternity in development.
Those who matter most, the beneficiaries, in the mechanisms that have failed, so that probably we now re-look at the approaches, invest them, and we might have a success. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The raised the issues of tax incentives, and I think we need to link them up with the whole issues of investment agreements. And I think we need a regional approach or a continental approach to that, so that we'll have a regional continental policy to guide FDI, because at national level it's so difficult to negotiate with the investors. Two, the issue of public expenditure raised by Dr. Saif, which priorities, and has accused civil NGOs for firefighting. But I think the whole issue, because financing a budget is a tool, you need to agree on the priorities. And if we are talking about structural transformation, what does it look like? Where should we put our money? And that, I think, should determine where the money goes. So there wouldn't be any reason for firefighting if we know what to do. And I think it goes also to what Naso was saying about the infrastructure. What kind of infrastructure do we need to bring about structural transformation? Not the structure which is on the coast, but which is internal to provide, intra-regional trade. Lastly, I think there is a lot of over-concentration on illicit financial flows. They are legitimate legal flows. For example, under FDI, we agree under the bilateral investment treaties we have signed, we allow investors to transfer all their monies out of our countries. And so what I'm saying, we need to look at both the illicit, but also those illegal means. When you look at the Mbeki report, one of his comments is that Africa is breeding. The resources are just flowing out, whether illicit, whether legal. So we need to look at both the illegal and those legal imports. Thank you, Chair.
30 years of civil society, and now in my position as one who sits in Parliament and working with government, and one who's also interacted with the African Union, that institution is indeed quite weak. So as we try to come up with an agenda for Africa, I think what needs to come to mind is, where is it going to be located? Who has the capacity? I think the word is not exactly capacity, but the legitimacy, even in terms of its operational mechanism to carry this. I'm thinking from the perspective of PIDA, for example, and some of its initial challenges as being birthed in as an instrument for integrating Africa. But moving from that very quickly again, is the fact that I think I need to ask you, Charles, directly, what is wrong with the Lagos Plan of Action? What is wrong with it? We must return to the Lagos Plan of Action. We must. It is our product. What I have seen in the one day I have been here is that even in terms of the conversations that we've had so far, we are working on the fringes of a number of things which we have been very critical about. We've been very critical about the MDG and its operational mechanisms. We've been critical about trade agreements. We've been critical about the quantity of ODI. We've been critical about so many things. What needs to change in order for it to be structural is that the African countries themselves must be at the center of the driving of these processes. And if we want them to drive it, we must go to something they themselves have already identified as an agenda for action. Many years back when that plan was done, it was easier for Africa to speak on issues like that with a common voice. At the African Union today, it's much more difficult for you to get that kind of congruence. So we need to return to it as the framework from where we begin to interrogate the many new thoughts that are being presented, as well as what we have done in between the time when that plan of action was passed and today. Thank you very much.
In some cases, in many countries here, we face with the situation that the government has two choices, either to spend in the social infrastructure and to continue, and under the pressure from whatever advocacy or the development partners, to invest only on the social sector. And then that I just compare the outcomes when you invest, which should come first. So that is the debate, the state of the debate between the two sector analysis. One point actually raised about the issue of the financing. Usually in economics, we have three sources of financing. We have domestic financing, we have external financing, either through ODA, official development assistance, or we go for the bilateral. I am very happy that these days we have opportunities. So financing is not a big issue for many African countries now in regard to this point. And we in Sudan, we believe that always cheap is expensive. Since 1985, we take the expensive loans. We take the expensive loans with the result, instead of taking concessional loans without getting any significant result in the ground. And that is our philosophy on all this kind of the idea. Finally, what I'm trying to say, it is high time for us also to look and to think independently. Still, we are contaminated. I'm sorry to say that, but the way that we are thinking still have a problem. If you remember in 2007, when we were talking about the agriculture, for the last five decades, we are advocating agriculture as engine of growth for Africa. What happens when the price is going up? We went to the wrong side of the debate. Vulnerability, poor people will suffer from the prices. We don't know where we are going if everything is harm for Africa. So it is very important, as mentioned by my colleagues, there is an instrumentals where we can continue on this kind of the advocating for the policy analysis. It is not all doom, all gloom in the region. It is, we are progressing. If you look for just for the last decades, all the socio-economic indicators, we believe that Horn of Africa region is the worst region in the continent. Despite all these difficulties, despite all the conflicts we have, but our social indicator in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in Ghana, in Djibouti, in Kenya, the collective are going very well. But the whole issue is how to really to accelerate and then to do the policy choice. By just only, I will do the final question for the audience. Has time come for a new approach? If SAPS took almost 15 years, PRSP now 15 years, shall we revisit the framework? Thank you.
Okay, quickly, about this thing of social investment or economic growth. The whole thing should be, what I'm against is sequencing. First development, then democracy. First growth, then distribution. it leads invariably to no democracy, no development. This is what we are against. And any government, any human being actually works under budget constraint. If you have anything available, then there is no economics at all. So it is a matter of trade-off and it's a matter of option. And that is where policy making is very important, the involvement of those stakeholders who will be affected by the policies taken. So in that sense, it is not a matter of saying first this, first that, but it is a matter of it's a matter of looking at it in a holistic manner and moving forward. VAT. I have nothing against, we start from the premise, tax is not a cost. Tax is a contribution, as somebody said, we make to live in a human society. So in that sense, taxing people according to their capacity to pay, I have nothing against it. But what's happening is VAT. I will start with, are you British? Okay, you said ODI. I will start with the UK. According to the admittance of the UK government, tax dodging costs the UK Treasury £35 billion a year. The Cameroon government made social spending cut of 30,000. It is easier to cut social spending than forcing multinationals not to dodge and pay their taxes. That is also exactly what IMF and World Bank did to Africa. They told us, liberalize your trade. The customs duties which African governments were receiving went down, and they said, okay, tax your poor and compensate for it. That is what happened. So in that sense, I'm against such measures. But that everybody contributes according to economic capacity, it is a welcome thing. So, and this thing of saying regressive taxation, progressive spending, which with the IMF, actually, they have moved a bit away from that. Okay, so in that sense, it is what I'm saying is, what leads to this is, instead of stopping tax dodging, instead of stopping premature liberalization of African markets, what you lose there, and it is easier to suppress the poor, you put it on the poor. That is what I'm objecting. One thing about illicit flows and illicit flows or the legal. Okay, technical definition, tax evasion is criminal, tax avoidance is not criminal.
Yes.
And there is somebody in America who should have said what divides tax evasion from avoidance is prison wall. But what has happened is there are ports now. The wall is no more there because through the facilitation of banks and security jurisdictions, you can transit from avoidance to evasion very easily. So, and you are right, the focus on illicit makes us forget the legal mechanism. For example, there is a multinational beer company operating in Ghana. There was a case study done. What the study found out, done by ActionAid, was that this multinational company paid less taxes than a kiosk beer vendor in Accra. And then what do you call it? There were, no, it was not exemptions. This company was saying they borrowed sevenfold of their original investment from a bank in Mauritius. They said they have paid millions of dollars for financial management services from Switzerland and Switzerland. So these are mechanisms which are so-called legal, but if facilitation of wrong transaction is criminal for me, if there is financial management service, there is no employee for this firm which is giving financial management services to a company from Europe investing in Africa. But all the fictive firms, shell companies which are registered in British Virgin Islands, who owns them? That's what we want them to tell us. So through such mechanisms, it is very artificial for me now to speak about evasion is illegal and avoidance is something like that. Is why I prefer the word tax dodging. Aggressive tax planning is tax dodging, and it should be combated in the same way. But we have to be careful about our figures because the illicit thing does not take such, for example, mispricing is not considered in the illicit flows calculation. Avoided or foregone income is not included in all these things. So we have to be careful about the figures, but as an approach, tax avoidance and evasion, plus the two make tax dodging, which is a criminal activity. Thank you.
I'd just like to say that the choice between social spending and infrastructure spending is a false choice. It's not a useful debate. And the foundation is really interested in, commissioning some work on what would an infrastructure design look like that fostered sustainable and equitable growth. How would you design infrastructure? Maybe some of these big projects would be in that plan, but for civil society and even for government to oppose something, we need an alternative. What is the alternative? What kind of infrastructure will foster the kind of structural transformation that we're all talking about, that would foster industrialization so that we're consuming what we produce, not necessarily what China produces? And so we're looking for case studies of the 51 priority projects that are in the priority action plan of PETA, so that we're able to be in a position to say knowledgeably which contribute to structural transformation and which don't. But I want to make 5 very quick points that show why we're so suspicious of this plan. The plan comes externally. It's the group of 20, the BRICS and the G7 that are designing long-term financing for this plan by financial speculators, the kind of speculators in derivatives that triggered the U.S. Collapse that rippled all over the world. So if we have more domestic resource mobilization in Africa, do we really want it to go to pay off 25% rates of return for private equity investors and hedge funds that sit on Wall Street in the City of London? I don't think so. So the bias is towards institutional speculators in financing this plan. The second bias is towards huge scale. Right now, civil society is stopping the Inga 3 dam until the designers agree to at least have 50% of Inga's power go to the people that live in the region, because as Inga 3 was designed, the big dam, 90% of the power would go to transnational corporations. Bujagali, cost overruns. Some people pay 1/10 of their monthly income for electricity. So when there's scale, there's real dangers involved. The third thing is that the first era of infrastructure was the colonialization era, where everything was shipped out. When I look at the maps that I showed all of you, it looks really suspicious that there's so much on the coast. You mentioned this. Why don't we see the kind of regional integration that everybody blah, blah, blah talks about? Everybody talks about it, okay? But who's designing the plan for it to happen so that Africans are supplying Africans? And, lastly, there's this terrible myth that when there are public-private partnerships and private investments, some of the money is for free. That we're taking these scarce government resources and multiplying them. And with good PPPs, sometimes there is a value addition. But again, this has a bias towards only PPPs. Even the OECD says that's a stupid idea. You should have, as someone over there called for, a cost-benefit analysis that takes into account gender, that takes into account environment, and especially takes into account long versus short-term returns, because these speculators are looking for really high short-term returns to come out of Africa, and that's what I don't like. So anybody that wants to design an alternative to PIDA, even a local one or a regional one, that's what I'd like to hear. Thank you.
I think we should give our panelists a round of applause. I think there is no point trying to summarize this. I just wanted to make two points, actually, also in response to Honorable Nkoyo Toyo's question about why isn't Lagos Plan of Action being implemented. I am sure that aspects of the African Union and NEPAD will say that the infrastructure chapter of the Lagos Plan of Action is being implemented. That's the argument that NEPAD makes. The argument that NEPAD says, well, NEPAD is now an African Union entity. NEPAD signed on to PIDA on behalf of the African Union. NEPAD is the bit of the African Union entities where I see public discourse and access to its discussions remain closed to a large extent. So I think a number of very interesting points have come up, which could be a very useful way of engaging Africa's institutions, including NEPAD. Point number one, that it seems rather weirdly accidental that the priority infrastructure projects are circling our coasts and connecting our natural resource bases to the coast. It's weird. So somebody needs to explain. And this is important because of the point that Jimmy made. Infrastructure must play many roles. Move our people, move our goods, move our services to our people and between them. Prove that this is happening. Because I think the other point which is made is that the equity issue is embedded in the way in which the development system and the growth program itself emerges. Therefore, you cannot set up a system of major public spending and obligations. That can't also tell us exactly how this is going to bring about our relatively equitable society as you grow, as all spending one way or the other will bring about some growth. But the benefit of that is the question. So that's really also a problem. The other thing is that there is a bias for big things. Now, that is a political debate. The big things definitely are useful. But what is the right mix between the big, the medium, and the small that serves the different parts of the economy? So transformation is connected. We always say that the biggest areas of momentum, drive, and jobs are in small and medium-sized enterprises. Therefore, the structure of investment and infrastructure should serve this as well. So a balanced economy is one that puts these bits together. So weirdly accidental, maybe, or coincidental, which you have to ask, that there is such a preferences for the big. And these preferences for the big therefore suggest a certain financing pattern. And that financing pattern privileges and prioritizes certain ways of financing. And brings back the point about external dependency of finances that Dereje raised. If we are designing systems of infrastructure that requires that you only can be financed way over above your rate of generation of domestic resources tied to your growth, somebody has to pay for that. And the cost associated with it. Therefore, that's an issue. That would entrench the question of external dependency on foreign finance. I think the question of domestic resource mobilization remains very central, Because after all, first and foremost, it is our resources, and that could be natural resources. The point Jimmy said about the different resource space. If it is natural resources, then earlier discussions about the share of rents, even before you transform it into other forms of capital that you share, that the share of rent is critical. And every one of our countries is actually very, even Benin is very increasingly dependent on natural resources in one form or the other. But even that natural resource extraction as rent must generate a way in which we can tax ourselves and build the savings capacity. So a tax system is important, but a tax system is a political debate. And Dereje makes a very important point. If the way in which incomes are concentrating at the moment also translates into the dominance of politics, then the people who rule basically protect themselves from contributing to society and are quite happy to be part of PPPs because their wealth is not here and is not rooted in the process of production, consumption that lifts everybody up. This is why income concentration in a certain way is a problem if it then affects the way in which we build our political systems. And it is really true that a balance is important between the social and the infrastructure. But we must not swing the balance to the other extreme, where we feel that the social, health, and education does not contribute to growth. They do. And so that balance is absolute. Anyway, as I said, the discussion was about raising these issues and having a reflection and going forward. Thank you very much and bon appetit. One point? I think now is